Your silence was not wasted. God was watching the whole time. This message is for those who felt unseen, unheard, or forgotten while they stood still in moments of heartbreak, confusion, or stillness. You weren't abandoned. You weren't passed over. Your silence had power, and heaven was tuned in to every breath, every unspoken prayer, every tear that slipped down your cheek in secret. If you've ever questioned if God noticed the parts of your story you couldn't even speak out loud, this video is for you. Please watch this video until the end. Subscribe to the channel and like this video. There's something here that your soul needs to hear. And when you're done, we encourage you to type your warmest wishes in the comments, speak them into existence. And don't forget to include the number 77, a symbol of divine completion and perfect timing. Let your energy join with others to activate a wave of healing, miracles, and clarity across this world. In the silence, something sacred is always being formed. Even when the noise of the world died down and you sat alone in a quiet room with nothing but your thoughts, you were not really alone. In fact, that was when God leaned in closer. Your silence wasn't a void, it was a vessel. It was the moment when your soul whispered things that your voice could never articulate. It was where your real prayers began, the kind that didn't come from your mouth, but from your spirit. People may have thought you gave up, but heaven knew better. Heaven saw you holding yourself together when everything around you was falling apart. Heaven saw you resist the urge to retaliate when you were misunderstood, blamed, or betrayed. Heaven saw you choose stillness over chaos. And that choice, though invisible to many, echoed loudly in the spiritual realm. You didn't always have the words, and that's okay. Sometimes, the most powerful statements we ever make are spoken through our restraint. Your dignity in silence was a louder sermon than any argument you could have won. You didn't need to prove your worth. Your strength was already speaking. God saw how you endured, how you waited, how you kept showing up when your heart was broken and your hands were trembling. And not a single moment of that was lost in the void. There is a sacred stillness that God honors. When everything around you demanded a reaction, you chose peace. When others cast judgment, you stayed silent, not because you were weak, but because you were wise. Silence can be a shield. Silence can be a declaration of trust. You trusted that you didn't need to defend what God would eventually reveal. You trusted that the truth would rise when it was time. And now that time is drawing near. Some seasons are not about speaking. They are about listening. They are about trusting the unseen hand of God to move behind the curtain of your life. They are about waiting without answers, hoping without clarity, and walking forward even when you don't hear a single word from above. Those are the hardest seasons, and yet, those are the ones where your faith grew its deepest roots. You need to know this. Your silence didn't delay your breakthrough. It deepened your preparation. God didn't overlook you. He was observing you, carefully, intimately, tenderly. Your patience, your quiet loyalty, your tears at night, your words held back. All of it was sacred. All of it was seen. It is in silence that warriors are trained. Not in the spotlight, not in applause, but in the hidden quiet places where integrity is tested and character is built. You have been forged in fire, silently. You've been growing in places no one else could see. You've been sowing faith like seeds into the ground, where it looked like nothing was happening, but roots were growing deep beneath the surface. And God, He was never far, not for a moment. Every time you cried alone in your car, every time you stayed awake in bed, wondering if your prayers would ever be answered, Every time you stared at your ceiling, waiting for a sign, He was there. He was watching not to punish, but to protect, to preserve, to prepare. You see, silence is a sacred trust. It means you're allowing God to speak when you're done speaking. It means you believe in a greater justice than what the world can offer. It means you've chosen alignment with heaven over applause from people. And that beloved soul is never wasted. In fact, it's in those moments where God begins to write the next chapter of your story with ink that doesn't fade. There are angels who stood still in reverence every time you stayed quiet when you could have shouted, every time you showed grace instead of anger, every time you whispered, "God, I trust you," even when you were trembling inside. You think nothing happened, but everything changed in those moments. You may not have noticed it yet, but heaven has already started opening doors you never could have forced open with your voice. Your silence carried authority, and God is about to honor what you didn't say, more than what others screamed, because heaven knows the full context of your story. And heaven is just. You didn't miss your chance. You didn't fall behind. Nothing was delayed just because you didn't speak up. In fact, what's coming is bigger than anything words could have earned for you. You didn't waste time in stillness. You saved your future with it. Now is the moment where everything hidden begins to be revealed. But this time, it won't be you who speaks. It will be God. He will speak through circumstances, through divine alignments, through the peace in your spirit, through the favor that cannot be explained, through the restoration that no one expected. You stayed quiet when it hurt. Now heaven will speak loudly on your behalf. The people who misjudged you in your silence will begin to see a version of you they never imagined. And they'll know it wasn't you who elevated yourself. It was something far greater. It was the reward of one who kept the faith, honored the silence, and waited for the right moment. You are stepping into a season where the seeds you planted in silence will blossom in the open. The tears you cried in the dark will become the testimony you share in the light. God is turning your quiet obedience into undeniable glory. Don't regret the moments you kept quiet. Don't question the times you bit your tongue. Don't second-guess the long nights where you chose trust over panic. Because all of it mattered, all of it counted, and all of it was seen. This is not the end of your story. It's the moment before the miracle. It's the pause before the orchestra begins to play. Your silence was not wasted. It was a prelude. And now, the divine crescendo is coming. Keep holding on. Keep trusting. And most importantly, remember, your silence was never ignored. God was watching the whole time. And what He's about to do will make every moment of quiet feel like the beginning of something holy. There are moments in life when silence becomes your last refuge, not because you don't have anything to say, but because you've said it all before. You've cried out, you've prayed, you've tried explaining yourself, you've tried defending your side, and then one day, you simply stopped. Not because you gave up, but because your spirit needed a different kind of strength, the kind that isn't measured in words, but in surrender. That was the turning point, though you may not have recognized it. The day you stopped speaking was the day your soul started listening more deeply than ever before. In that quiet space, God moved closer, not to scold you, but to honor the trust it took to stop explaining and start believing. You may have looked like you were giving up, but what you really did was give in to something greater, something divine, something holy. The world may misinterpret silence. It may think of it as weakness, passivity, or indecision. But heaven sees it as the highest form of spiritual discipline. Not everyone can be quiet in the face of false accusations. Not everyone can remain still when provoked, when misunderstood, when misrepresented. But you did, and that silence was louder in the heavens than any shouting match here on earth. God heard what you didn't say. He saw the weight you carried behind your smile. He saw how hard it was to sit still when everything inside of you wanted to run, speak out, cry, or fight. That restraint, that was divine maturity. That was growth. And heaven celebrated you every time you chose to hold your peace and let him fight the battle for you. You weren't forgotten in those quiet moments. On the contrary, you were being watched more closely than ever. Because silence is where trust is proven. Silence is where the fire of faith either burns out or burns brighter. You chose to keep the flame alive. And now, heaven is preparing to reward what you did in secret, what you endured in solitude, what you carried in silence. Do you realize how sacred that is? Some people will never understand the cost of your quiet strength. They'll never know what it took to keep walking with no clear answers. They'll never see the nights you stayed awake, asking questions into the dark, and receiving nothing but stillness in return. But God saw it all. And that stillness wasn't empty. It was holy. It was heavy with unseen activity. While you sat in silence, the heavens were moving on your behalf. You were never in pause mode. You were in preparation mode. And the silence you walked through has now become the foundation for something permanent. Something that no chaos can shake, no lie can ruin, no enemy can undo. Because it wasn't built in the noise, it was built in the quiet. And anything birthed in sacred silence carries the signature of God Himself. There are things forming now, things that were only made possible because you didn't speak too soon. You didn't act out of fear. You didn't force your way into places God hadn't prepared for you yet. Instead, you waited. You held your ground. And even when your knees were trembling, your spirit stood tall. That posture, silent, humble, strong, is the posture that heaven exalts. God isn't drawn to noise. He's drawn to stillness that carries weight. And your stillness carried more weight than you'll ever know. It was a magnet for grace. It was a signal to the spiritual realm that said, I trust my Creator, even when I don't understand Him. That kind of trust is rare, and it never goes unrewarded. The doors that are about to open for you won't just be ordinary doors. They'll be divine responses to the seasons where you held your breath instead of your pride, where you clung to your faith instead of fighting for control, where you allowed yourself to be misunderstood rather than distort your peace trying to explain your worth. And now, the tables are turning, not because you forced them to, but because heaven is orchestrating justice on your behalf. Your silence was not passive, it was prophetic. It declared, I will not act outside of divine timing. And that declaration gave God room to act with precision, with power, with purpose. You don't need to go back and correct the record. You don't need to revisit the old conversations or try to make people see the full picture. That's not your job anymore. Your silence gave heaven full permission to tell your side through actions, blessings, and revelations that no one will be able to deny. Watch what happens next. Watch how vindication comes, not through your words, but through divine orchestration. Watch how God makes it unmistakably clear that your silence wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. That your quietness wasn't apathy, it was alignment. Let this sink in. God never required you to be loud to be effective. He required you to be loyal. Loyal to the process, loyal to the calling, loyal to His timing. And you were. You stayed when it hurt. You waited when it made no sense. You rested when the world rushed. And now, your soul is about to rise with strength the world cannot comprehend. What is coming is not random. It is justice. It is harvest. It is reward. For every moment you chose stillness over speaking. For every time you chose grace over rage. For every situation where you could have exploded, but instead imploded in silence, offering your pain to God rather than projecting it onto others. That was divine maturity. That was you being shaped into someone who could carry greatness with humility, power with patience, authority with compassion. And now it's time. Time for the unveiling. Time for the world to witness the version of you that was formed in fire, carved in quiet, and strengthened in stillness. Not because you shouted your truth, but because you trusted His truth. He was watching the whole time. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from fear, but from faith. It's not the silence of someone defeated. It's the silence of someone who knows that the truest answers don't always come from shouting, but from stillness. You lived that. You breathed that. You carried that truth in moments when everything around you demanded a reaction. And instead, you responded with nothing but presence. People don't always see the power in that kind of restraint. The world teaches us to clap back, to fight louder, to demand our worth be recognized through noise. But you did the opposite. You let your silence speak for you. You let your absence become your answer. You let your peace be your protection. That takes a level of courage that few can understand, and even fewer can maintain. But God understood. God saw. Every moment you bit your tongue, every tear you wiped before anyone noticed, every time you chose not to explain yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you, He counted them. Those moments were not overlooked. They were recorded in the sacred book of your becoming. Silence is not an empty space. It's a sacred shelter. It's the place where your soul finds protection from the chaos of the outside world. And in that shelter, God whispered things to you that no one else could hear. That's why you feel different. That's why you carry something weighty now. Because your silence wasn't idle. It was holy ground where transformation happened. When you walk through silent seasons, it's not because God has turned His face away. On the contrary, it's often because He is watching you more intently than ever, not with disappointment, but with delight, like a sculptor watching their masterpiece take form, like a gardener watching a seed push through the soil, like a parent watching their child choose integrity over impulse. That's how heaven saw you. You may have thought your silence was a loss, but in truth, it was a setup. Every time you held your tongue when you could have fought back, you created space for God to move. Every moment you didn't defend yourself, heaven prepared to do it for you. You think you were just surviving, but you were actually positioning. You were aligning your soul with something higher, deeper, eternal. There were conversations that never happened, and thank God they didn't. There were arguments you walked away from, and heaven applauded your restraint. There were situations where you could have shouted, could have demanded, could have exploded, but instead you walked away, not out of weakness, but because you knew what wasn't worth disturbing your spirit for. And in that stillness, something eternal was being written into your story. There's a language in silence that only God fully understands. He interprets what's too deep for words, the groans, the sighs, the moments you looked up at the ceiling and said nothing, but your heart was screaming. The days you sat in your car, parked in a random place, just to breathe and cry and ask Him why. Those were prayers. Those were offerings. And they reached Him. You didn't need eloquence. You didn't need long speeches. Your pain had a frequency, and God heard it. Not just heard it, He responded to it. Quietly, precisely, in ways you couldn't see at the time, but will begin to see now, in this next season. Because what was happening during your silence was never stagnation. It was preparation. Heaven was moving, orchestrating, designing encounters and revelations for you. Doors you didn't even knock on will begin to open. Paths you didn't see before will start to appear. Why? Because you were faithful in the silence. You stayed grounded when others demanded attention. You were steady while storms raged all around you. That's why what's coming will have a supernatural signature. It won't make sense to anyone who didn't see what you endured silently. But that's okay. This next chapter isn't about explanation. It's about elevation. This is not a time to prove yourself. It's a time to let your story speak without saying a single word. Your life will be the evidence. Your growth will be the answer. And yes, some will wonder how you arrived here so quietly, so gracefully, so full of clarity and purpose. But they didn't see the nights you wept with no reply. They didn't see the mornings you got up with heavy bones but kept walking anyway. They didn't see the ache behind your silence. But God saw, and that was enough. He was watching the whole time. Not just watching, but planning. Not just observing, but building. While you stayed silent, He was laying foundations. While you waited, He was weaving miracles. And now, the unveiling begins. You will not need to justify how you got here. Your silence was not wasted. It was your strategy. Your stillness was not in vain. It was your strength. You didn't lose your voice. You learned when not to use it. You didn't lose the fight. You won by not engaging where your peace was too precious to spend. Every moment of restraint became a stone in the foundation of your future. Every silent choice turned into spiritual capital. You may have felt invisible, but heaven was investing in you the entire time. What comes next is not a repayment, it's a reward. Not because you demanded it, but because you became it. Your transformation didn't happen in the spotlight. It happened in the shadows. And now it's time for the light to reveal what has quietly taken root. God saw your silence as sacred, and now He will use it as the backdrop for something divine. Something that can't be undone, can't be ignored, and can't be denied. The quietest chapters of your life were not blank pages. They were written in invisible ink, seen only by the eyes of heaven. While others moved loudly, performed publicly, and reached outward, you were being rewritten inwardly. The silence you walked through was not a delay, it was a deepening. Every pause had purpose. Every still moment was sacred ground. And God walked closely with you on that silent path. You didn't realize it at the time, but your silence became your sanctuary. While the world tried to define you by what you didn't say, heaven defined you by what you endured without saying it. The silence shaped your soul. It matured your spirit. It carved space within you for wisdom to settle, for divine perspective to replace human reaction. Sometimes the loudest transformation happens when nothing seems to be happening at all. The soil doesn't shout when a seed is growing. The roots don't make noise as they anchor deeper. You are becoming solid, and the evidence of that isn't in what you said. It's in what you didn't say. It's in the battles you chose not to fight, the stages you walked away from, the opinions you released instead of chasing. There's a peace that comes when you stop trying to be understood and start understanding that God understands it all. That's the kind of peace you began to carry. It wasn't forced. It wasn't fake. It was forged through nights of silence, days of solitude, and seasons where the only voice you had was the one inside you saying, "Hold on, don't quit." He sees you. And he did. He saw you when your silence wasn't just an act of maturity, but an act of survival. When you went quiet, not because you wanted to, but because you didn't have anything left. The exhaustion, the heartbreak, the confusion, the disappointment, all of it buried in a quiet that felt like exile, but was actually sacred consecration. You weren't abandoned, you were being guarded. God hid you in plain sight, covering you with silence, while He protected your becoming. He let them overlook you, because being seen too soon could have stolen your stillness, and your stillness was your strength. You needed that silence to stabilize, to rebuild, to remember who you are without the noise of other voices shaping your story. So if you ever wondered why it felt like the world forgot you for a while, know this: it was never a forgetting. It was a forming. Heaven was holding you in the hush of preparation. And now that the silence has served its purpose, God will make sure your voice returns. Not in noise, but in authority. Not in arguments, but in results. Because silence doesn't mean absence. It means alignment. It's a divine signal that something deeper is happening beneath the surface. And you aligned yourself with heaven's timing. That's why the next part of your journey won't require a campaign. It will unfold organically. Because what is birthed in the Spirit doesn't need validation from the crowd. It needs obedience. It needs patience. And you've already proven you carry both. This is why your silence was so powerful. It wasn't empty. It was echoing. In the spiritual realm, every time you chose peace over panic, surrender over striving, trust over retaliation, it sent out a frequency. That frequency created openings in the unseen, pathways only accessible by faith. You were moving dimensions in your stillness. You were accessing promises by not forcing the process. And while others were trying to make something happen, you stayed hidden. Not hiding out of fear, but hidden by design. God kept you concealed until you were strong enough not to be shaken, until you knew the difference between noise and purpose, until you stopped confusing visibility with value. Because what heaven is about to do in your life doesn't require you to shout about it. It will be loud all on its own. It will speak without needing a voice. It will answer every doubt without an explanation. Because it was forged in fire, yes, but also in silence. The kind of silence that sanctifies, that strengthens, that seals you for what's next. There will come a moment when the ones who misunderstood your quietness will wonder how you grew so deeply, so strongly, so unshakably rooted. And the truth is, they didn't see your roots because they were formed underground, in the places no one clapped for, in the hours no one applauded, in the seasons no one even knew you were fighting to stay standing. But God knew. He watched the nights you prayed silently under your breath because you didn't even have the energy to cry. He stood with you when you stood in rooms that felt heavy with tension, but you chose peace. He walked beside you when you said nothing, not because you agreed with the injustice, but because you refused to let bitterness steal your spirit. You thought you were silent, but heaven saw you roaring in the spirit. And that roar, it's about to be answered. Not with noise, not with chaos, but with divine clarity. God doesn't just respond to sound, He responds to sincerity. And your silence was saturated with sincerity, with pure hope, with raw faith, with a deep, aching trust that whispered, "Even if I can't see it, I still believe." That kind of trust is dangerous, in the best way. It breaks cycles, it shatters strongholds, It rewrites legacies, and it's that kind of trust you cultivated in your quiet seasons. So now, as things begin to shift, you won't have to force your way in. Your silence already opened doors that noise couldn't. You won't have to demand to be seen. God already made sure the right eyes are about to notice you. You won't have to argue for your place. You'll be invited, honored, and positioned because you waited. You waited in silence. You worshipped in silence. You wept in silence. You became fluent in a language most people never learn, the language of quiet strength. The kind that speaks not in volume, but in vibration. The kind that doesn't need to be heard to be felt. Your silence was not weakness. It was wisdom, wrapped in stillness. And though others misread you, God never did. You didn't choose silence because you had nothing to say. You chose silence because not everything deserves your energy. You could have spoken. You could have defended yourself. You could have shouted every truth you held in your heart. But you didn't, because something in you knew. Truth doesn't need to scream to be real, and not everyone is worthy of hearing the sacred things you carry. The silence wasn't easy. You swallowed so many words that wanted to burst out of you. You held back when your heart was pounding. You sat still when your mind was racing. You smiled in rooms where your spirit didn't feel safe. You kept walking when everything in you wanted to collapse. That's a different kind of power. That's the strength of the chosen. Because there is weight in being misunderstood. There is pain in being silent when you know the truth. But you didn't carry that weight alone. Heaven carried it with you. Every time you left a room instead of fighting back. Every time you laid your head down on a pillow full of unsaid words. Every time you showed grace when grace wasn't given to you. The divine took note. The divine leaned in. People may have looked at you and seen stillness, but heaven saw strategy. People may have thought you were weak, but angels knew you were being weaponized. The kind of person who doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. The kind of person who lets peace do the talking. The kind of person who understands timing speaks louder than tantrums. Because what you chose to do in silence, heaven is about to announce loudly. And what's beautiful is that you didn't stay silent for applause. You didn't endure just to prove anything. You didn't hold your tongue so someone would come back later and apologize. You did it because your soul was maturing. You were learning the sacred art of choosing battles, and even more, the sacred power of letting God fight them for you. There were moments when your silence was your only prayer. You had no words left. Just breathe, just presence, just aching surrender. And even that was enough, because God doesn't need your performance. He sees your posture. And yours was faithful. Yours was resilient. Yours was steady, even when your heart trembled. That kind of posture shakes heaven. It moves the divine hand. It activates a realm of favor that isn't for the noisy, but for the pure. Not for the perfect, but for the persevering. And that's you. You persevered. You stayed quiet when you could have erupted. You stayed present when you could have disappeared. You kept going when every part of you said, it's easier to just stop. But something inside wouldn't let you quit. That something, that was the divine whisper. That was God's breath inside your being, keeping you from crumbling completely. And now, that whisper is turning into a wind, a strong wind, a rushing, undeniable, life-shifting wind of restoration, revelation, and reward. Because every seed of silence you planted, God watched it fall. And now, every one of them is starting to grow. He didn't just see the moments you were quiet. He saw what it cost you. He saw the self-control it took, the ego you had to bury, the narratives you refused to correct, the tears you let fall behind closed doors while pretending you were okay in public. He saw the restraint that came from love, the stillness that came from trust, the silence that came from your refusal to become like those who wounded you. You didn't silence yourself. You sanctified yourself. And now the time of release is near. Not release into chaos, but release into purpose. Not noise, but clarity. Not reaction, but revelation. Because the kind of silence you endured wasn't passive, it was prophetic. You were protecting your spirit from contamination. You were guarding your energy. You were staying in alignment even when it was lonely. It's in that lonely place that heaven draws the closest. It's in the quiet that you hear the clearest. And it's in the seasons where nobody else seems to understand you that God speaks in the most intimate ways. So when people ask, "How did you get through all of that without losing your mind?" you'll smile, not because it was easy, but because it was sacred. You didn't survive because you were strong. You survived because you were seen. And there's a difference. Being seen by the world brings applause. Being seen by heaven brings alignment. And alignment is what you were walking into the whole time. That's why you didn't retaliate. That's why you stopped explaining. That's why you let go of the need to be right. Because you were being positioned for something higher, something bigger than the battles you walked away from, something brighter than the rooms you were left out of, something louder than any voice that tried to talk over your truth. What's coming now isn't just vindication, it's confirmation. It's the silent nod of heaven that says, "You did well, you kept going, you stayed clean." And that kind of reward, no one can steal it, no one can mimic it, no one can take credit for it, because no one saw the tears you cried into your pillow at 2 a.m. No one saw the fists you clenched to stop yourself from reacting. No one saw the breath you took to stay centered when everything around you was trying to unbalance you. But God saw, God felt, God moved, and now God acts, because your silence was never wasted. Now comes the turning of the page, not because you forced it, not because you shouted for it, but because you stayed, because you held your silence like a sword, because you trusted when trust was costly. The universe is aligning not in response to your words, but to your endurance. The realm of the divine is not activated by noise, but by knowing. And you knew, deep down, beneath the ache, beneath the silence, beneath the doubt, that God was watching. This isn't about being noticed by the world. This is about being remembered by heaven. Every moment you bit your tongue instead of lashing out, heaven remembered. Every time you chose peace over petty revenge, heaven remembered. Every time you walked away instead of exploding, heaven remembered. And now, heaven responds. You were never overlooked. You were hidden, sheltered, kept out of the noise so that your spirit could grow strong in the silence. You didn't miss the moment. The moment was being saved for you, reserved, protected. So when it arrives, it will fit perfectly in your hands, and you won't need to beg for it. You'll simply breathe and receive. The waiting season wasn't punishment, it was preparation. And the silence, that was where God was building the real foundation. Not the visible, not the impressive, the eternal, the untouchable, the sacred. That's what your silence shaped. And now the sacred is about to be seen, not as a spotlight, but as a sunrise, gradual, gentle, glorious, and undeniable. The kind of rising that makes no noise, but changes everything it touches. That's what's coming for you. You won't have to announce it. You won't have to explain it. The shift in your life will speak for itself. Because the one who watched you through every quiet storm has written your redemption into every future sunrise. You didn't waste your silence. You invested it. And now, the harvest is here. The ones who misunderstood you won't be able to deny what you're stepping into. The ones who walked away when you were quiet will hear the echo of your transformation without you saying a word. And the pain that once silenced you, it will become the power that carries you. Because you didn't just endure in silence, you were elevated by it. Now, your footsteps are different, calmer, wiser, rooted. You don't rush to be heard because you finally know the truth. The most powerful voices don't scream, they simply live. You don't need to prove anything. Your presence will do the talking. Your peace will preach louder than your pain ever could. And that peace was earned, fought for, held onto in the darkest nights when nobody saw you. But he did. He always did. God watched as you let your heart break quietly. He watched as you walked through lonely roads, whispering prayers no one else could hear. He watched when you turned down opportunities to get even, choosing instead to get still. He watched when you were betrayed, yet refused to betray yourself in return. And with every moment of silence, heaven whispered, "Wait. Just wait. I am not done." Now that wait is over, you're not who you were when you started this silent journey. You are deeper, softer in soul, sharper in spirit. You have become someone who no longer needs the noise to feel seen. You are seen by something far greater, by the one who created the silence to begin with. Because silence isn't emptiness, it's sacred space. It's where God sits closest, where heaven leans in, where the soul sheds everything false and finally becomes fully known. That's where you've been. And now, that space is shifting. The silence is turning into sound. Not chaotic sound, but divine declaration. A subtle but stunning unfolding. A new chapter that doesn't erase the silence, but honors it. You won't need to raise your voice. Life will raise it for you. Favor will raise it for you. Grace will announce what you chose not to. The silence didn't break you. It made you unbreakable. And now, it's time. Time for the quiet warrior to rise. Time for the long-forgotten to be remembered. Time for the one who waited to be awakened. You didn't fight to be heard. But heaven is about to echo your name in places your voice has never reached. You didn't push your way forward. But now, the way is opening. You didn't scream to be seen. But now your light is rising. You didn't demand justice. But now, justice is finding you. Because your silence was not forgotten. It was divine strategy. And heaven watched the whole time. So when the blessings begin to unfold, when the doors open, the favor flows, and the beauty emerges, remember, it's not a reward for being loud. It's the return of everything you grew in quiet. Your silence was never empty. It was sacred. And God was never far. He was watching.